Now, we've been in a series called The S Word, and it's not sustainability. The S word is the word sin, and my skin crawls when I hear that word. My skin crawls when I hear that word because I grew up in a church that talked about it in what I was describing as toxic or even somewhat psychologically damaging to myself as a child and also everyone else who was there. We're going to explore that a little bit. And so our teaching aims in this series is to recover this theological idea in a way that is emotionally intelligent and spiritually useful. These are our teaching aims. God did, in fact, talk about this sometimes, and humans have used and abused this word. We're trying to recover what did it mean in a way that was actually helpful to people, that didn't feel like an enormous weight dragging us down, but instead felt like an avenue to understand God and ourselves better. And what I found was in my church growing up, the more they talked about this, the worse I felt about myself. And that's the exact opposite of what it is intended to do. It is supposed to be a vector, a way for us to connect with God and slowly learn to love ourselves and the people around us. That this is supposed to be a helpful concept, not the one that we avoid at all costs. So we were working with a theologian from my seminary in Los Angeles, Fuller Seminary. He's a Finnish guy named Veli-Matti Karkkainen. And if you went to seminary today, you would have to read one of his dozens and dozens and dozens of books because the guy is a genius. He's kind of everywhere in the seminary world. And he suggested that the English word sin no longer corresponds properly to the Greek and Hebrew words, that this word has too many layers and too much baggage for it to work right anymore in corresponding to what the Bible talked about when it used the word sin. Instead, he suggested that we should start translating those words as misery. And so you get these astounding passages when you make that swap, when you stop saying the word sin and just instead say the word misery. You get passages like this: "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the misery of the world." That this is what Jesus was trying to say, that this is how Jesus' original followers experienced him. Not being bludgeoned over the head for every mistake, but instead to be the one, "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, laden, and I will take away the misery of the world." So through this series, we've been working on a couple of different angles here. It turns out the Bible talks about sin in much more expansive ways than just the dumb things you and I did in middle school. And I told my story last week that in middle school, I was at a church that constantly talked about sin, and I felt so bad because I was doing so many terrible things in middle school, just like every middle schooler does. But when you really pay attention to the way that the Bible talks about the word sin, it's a much more robust and much more helpful concept. So first we looked at the passages where sin seems to function more as a cosmic force. It is a great arch enemy of God, this misery with a capital M or sin with a capital S. And when we look at it from that angle, we see Jesus as a rescuer and redeemer. And what we learn about ourselves is that as Jesus rescues and redeems us, we're not sinners to be avoided, people with huge problems. Instead, humans are depicted as being set free and called home. That when we think of sin as the cosmic power defeated on the cross, that Jesus is instead saying to us, "You, my sons and daughters, are set free. You are called home." And those passages evoke this storyline that goes all the way through the Bible of Exodus and exile, that God is constantly liberating slaves. And Jesus was depicted on the cross as doing just the same thing for you and I spiritually, that every human to ever live was offered a kind of spiritual freedom. And then we talked about the passages that depict sin as disease, that you don't even have to feel guilty that you contracted this disease. Every human in human history has. You can't blame yourself. You should not feel guilt or shame because of this. It is just a thing that happened to us. And when we think about the passages that depict sin that way, we see Jesus as a healer. And the way that he heals us is by being with us. And the cross becomes this moment of utter identification with human beings, that Jesus, in this moment of pure, powerful solidarity, died to death just like you and I would. That Jesus could have forgiven every person to ever live, but instead he chose to identify deeply with us in powerful solidarity, so that no matter what happens to you in your life, Jesus can look you in the eye and say, "Me too." That Jesus heals and redeems us by his presence with us. And that is what the cross is about. That human beings died in horrible and tragic ways, and so did God. As a way of saying, "I am with you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you." And how does that identify us? Well, we're never alone. We're never without hope. The fact that God became just like you and me, suffered all the kinds of things that you and I suffered, means we're never alone. We're never without hope. And the storyline there is God's faithfulness to the covenant that he made with human beings. A covenant is this powerful kind of spiritual sort of contract where each side says, even if you break your side, I'm still going to do my side. And that's what we see in Jesus showing up, even though we didn't fulfill our end of the bargain every single time. Jesus shows up because he is faithful. So today we're talking about this third way of thinking about the word sin that is a little bit trickier. Sin as personal choice. But before we get there, I want to put this quote deeply in your mind. This is the way we're framing it. We talked about this last week. Unfortunately, the word sin in our vocabulary implies a culpability or personal fault, but in fact, the precise meaning of original sin is that we're not personally culpable for it, but it was somehow passed on to us, and all people share in it. It's like a disease we are all infected with. The supposed doctrine of original sin was actually meant to be a consolation, a comfort. Because if we know our own self as mixed, a mixed blessing, that each one of us is filled with contradictions and is a mystery even to ourselves, then we won't pretend that we could totally eliminate our faults. We could just stop pretending once we embrace that we all have this same type of problem. We don't even have to pretend that we could eliminate or even hide all that we consider unworthy or inferior within. There's a great freedom to embracing this other point of view. Now, sin as personal choice. We've been defining this as sin as misery. And when we think about it in terms of personal choice, what we find out is that I have made the personal choice at times to cause misery for other people or to cause misery for myself. That I've made the personal choice sometimes to cooperate with the cosmic power working against me or to empower or enable my disease. There is a truth to this part of things where I say, you know what, some of my problems are my own damn fault. And this is where we get to ask Jesus for lots of help. Misery as a personal choice. So we've been talking about these storylines that are activated across the entire scope of the Bible. When we look at sin from each angle, we learn something about Jesus and about ourselves through a storyline that is activated. And sometimes in those talks, you should go back and listen to them to kind of capture the idea that we're really changing the way we're thinking about this. Here we're going to, instead of ending with the activated storyline in the Bible, we're just going to start with it. This is like a main theme in the whole Bible, that you and I are offered a chance at a new heart. That whatever wounds, whatever baggage, whatever stuff we carry in our heart, Jesus is constantly inviting us to have a cleansing and renewing and a freedom flowing from within us. What is the condition of our heart? This is a major part of the Bible. This is a major theme. So here are a couple of passages. In Isaiah, this was one of those guys with sanctified imagination. Like when God finally shows up, that was his big question. And what we learn is some people are going to say religious type things, and yet they are not going to be doing and loving people in deeply spiritual ways. You can do something religious and not have a spirituality based on love and connection. That's what Jesus was teaching. And so they predicted, because this people, they draw near me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. And their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. That's an incredible passage. That to be afraid of God is actually a doctrine invented by human beings whose hearts were far from God. That's pretty incredible, actually. Thousands of years before Jesus, they said, one day God will come and reveal this to be the truth. That you can act in a spiritual and fearful way, and your heart can be far, far from God. So Jesus, all those years later, quotes this exact passage, that this was the problem in the world that Jesus lived in. This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as true belief the mere commandments of men. And in all the churches where everything has gone wrong, and the church that I grew up in, this was part of it, right? Teaching as true belief the commandments of men, while hearts were far from us. And so from this angle of misery as personal choice, the problem that Jesus is naming is that people's hearts are far from him. And so once Jesus was asked, what is the main thing? What's the main commandment? What's the main deal here? And Jesus replied, the first is love your Lord God with all your heart and with your soul and with your mind. This deep affection for God. That's the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Isn't that a remarkable passage, that there is an important way to love yourself? And there's one of the deep beliefs in the Bible, God as three and one, the Trinity. And scholars will sometimes call this the economic Trinity. What is exchanged between these three persons? And what they say is exchanged between the three persons of the Trinity is love. That is what binds them together. And something similar is depicted in this passage, that Jesus within the material world is creating a new kind of Trinity between you and me and himself. That we are a reconstituted new Trinity, exchanging love right here. Like I love myself, I should learn to love you because I have learned to love God. That we are giving and exchanging this profound bit of love that connects us to each other, that connects us to God. That it's a deep heart connection that is offered to us, that Jesus is offering to teach us. And it's depicted here when Jesus is explaining these are the two great commandments. And this, as we pull the thread of this grand storyline of the human heart, we get even deeper to something that scholars call the human vocations. What are humans put on the planet to do? The world's foremost New Testament scholar wrote about it this way. He said this, N.T. Wright. The main task of this vocation of human beings is image bearing. You and I were created in God's image. We're reflecting the Creator's wise stewardship into the world and reflecting the praises of all creation back to its maker. Those who do so are a royal priesthood, the kingdom of priests, the people who are called to stand at the dangerous but exhilarating point where heaven and earth come together. Within this narrative, creation itself is understood as a kind of temple, a heaven and earth duality, where humans function as the image bearers in this cosmic temple of creation, part of earth yet reflecting the life and love of heaven. This is how creation was designed to function and flourish under the stewardship of the image bearers. Humans are not called to just keep certain moral standards in the present and to enjoy God's presence hereafter in heaven, but to celebrate, worship, procreate, and take responsibility within the rich, vivid, developing life of creation. You and I are conduits for the vitality of God. God's loving presence is given to the human heart for us to project back out into the world. That is the vocation of human beings. As I thought about this talk, I thought about this moment in August of 1999. And I thought about introducing this story by saying it was the time I went to get a donut, because that is a crucial part of the story, but it was also a part of the story where I learned about what father's loves look like. I had a great dad. He's a great guy. Bugged me to death so many times, but there are moments, right, where you get to see what is in someone's heart. And so in August of 1999, we went to church together, and all my friends from church were going to go get donuts afterwards. And my parents said, did you finish this one particular task? My friends had slept over, so I left all of our blow-up mattresses and all of the extra mattresses that my parents had kept in our house just for this. I left them all in the hallway, all in a big pile. And they said, we've been asking you for weeks to clean that up. Did you do that? No, I did not. Okay. Go home and do that, then you can go get a donut. So I took my parents' car. I drove home. My other friend from church, whose name was also Matt, because in 1982 when I was born, that was the most popular boy name. Half of every soccer team I played on were Matts. So Matt and I drove home. It was 15 minutes. I cleaned it up. It took 5 minutes. This was an important life lesson for me in itself. Just do it. Then as we were driving back, my parents live out on this old country road, and I was turning left. Someone came over the hill. They were speeding, just T-boned, destroyed my parents' car. Huge driver's side impact. Everybody's airbags went off. Later, I went back, and I was looking for parts of my car because the stereo was way over there, and stuff from the trunk was all over the place. This was a major collision, major high-speed collision. My friend Matt was fine, but I was just all kinds of messed up. Big bruise all along the side of my body. Knocked unconscious. When I came to, I was strapped to the backboard. I was already in the ambulance. And I knew I was going to be okay because my body hurt, but the most painful thing was where my head was stiff on the backboard, strapped to it as tightly as humanly possible. That's how they stabilize your head and neck. And then you get to the hospital, they give you every kind of test imaginable, and they give you a couple MRIs, all kinds of x-rays. But in between them, you just have to wait. And so I'm strapped there In the hallway, finally, my mom and dad show up. I was 17 years old. I just destroyed their car. And as they stepped in, all I could say was, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry. And do you know what they said? We don't care. We don't care even a little bit. We're so glad you're okay. And I've reflected on that moment because there are crisis moments in our lives where we get to really see what is in our hearts. And for them in that moment, what was really in their heart was, I'm so glad you're okay. And so as we go on this journey of thinking about what is it like when we make the personal choice to cause others or ourselves misery, when we step outside of the loving economy of God's love comes to our hearts and then we exchange that love together, when we make the conscious choice to say, I am not doing that this time, how does God really respond? You see, there is a different scholar who said the cross was a crisis in God's heart. This is God showing up at the hospital and saying, is my child alive? That is what is going on the cross in God's heart and mind. And then when we think about it from this other angle, that we have made the personal choice to cause ourselves and others misery, we could understand maybe that God was upset, right? That we have caused so much misery to each other. Maybe it makes sense that God is sometimes angry. And yet that is not the main thing in his heart. So N.T. Wright says this, it ought to be clear from all of this that the reason sin leads to death is not at all as it is often supposed, that death is an arbitrary and draconian punishment for miscellaneous moral shortcomings. The link's actually deeper than that. He wrote, this distinction I'm making is the distinction between the ticket you get if you're driving too fast and the car crash that will happen if you drive too fast around a sharp bend on a wet road. The ticket is arbitrary. Who cares? It's an imposition with no organic link to the offense. The crash is intrinsic. The direct consequence of the behavior. We're miserable because we've stepped outside the cycle of love and we've said, I'm not living in the exchange of love with God and with each other. And so the question becomes, what does God do with us? What does he do when we decide to live our lives outside of the economy of love? What does Jesus do? One of the passages we've taken a look at is this one right here. That when we swap out the word misery for the word sin, it just pops in this different way. For our sake, God made him to be misery who knew no misery, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. When I think about being strapped to that backboard and my parents coming in and me saying, I'm so sorry, and them saying, we don't care at all, we love you. I think, would my dad have switched spots with me right there? Absolutely. With my own son who is on my socks, if I imagine him there, would I switch places with him? Absolutely, in a heartbeat. In a heartbeat. And somehow, in the divine imagination, that was God's plan. Because here it is. He took on the misery so that we could take on the righteousness and goodness. The story of the cross is just switching places. And in the medieval era, theologians used the word communicate, that our misery was communicated to Jesus, and his love and righteousness and goodness was communicated to us. It is quite simply a switching of roles, a switching of places. That God took what was maybe coming to us so that we could have what was really coming to him. And that is the powerful offer made to each and every one of us. God is going through this crisis in his heart that his children have gone off and made themselves and others miserable. And what does he do? He offers to switch places with them. And when we refocus on the grand narrative of the condition of my heart and of your heart, what starts to emerge is a picture of God saying, let me put my heart within you. And this becomes the great promise, the great offer to each one of us. That God could put his heart within us. So you get these passages like this. One of the predictions about what Jesus would be doing was, I will give you a new heart, a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove from your body the heart of stone and give you a soft heart. So what do? Oh, we start looking in our hearts. We start saying, where am I miserable? And where have I chosen it? Where have I made others miserable? It takes so much courage to say, this is what is in my heart. And yet the profound reward on the other side of it is this new life, this deeper connection, re-entering the cycle of love with others and with God. That is the strange promise, the strange invitation that God gives to us. So, one prayer that I love. Search me, God, know my heart, test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This term offensive way, they're not arbitrary things. It's not random stuff. It's not just a ticket. It's where have I caused misery to myself or others? And Jesus, how might I get back on your path? So as we close this series here, we have chosen to have a moment that followers of Jesus have been doing for years and years, century after century, millennia after millennia. On the last night of Jesus' life, he gathered his friends who did not understand him, did not understand his plan. And knowing he was going to die the next day, what did he do? He had dinner with them. He connected one last time. And there, again, one last time, he tried to explain everything that will happen to me. Oh, it'll be for your benefit. It'll be so you can have a new heart, so we can have a new relationship. And so there on the last night of his life, Jesus said, tonight we'll have bread, but it won't just be bread. Tonight it would also be my body broken for you. Tonight we'll have wine like we always do, but tonight it won't just be wine. It'll be my blood for a new covenant, a new relationship between you and me. And what Jesus was doing was using the terminology and the imagery of the day to say we could switch places, we could switch hearts, we could reconnect if you want to. And that same invitation is extended again and again. As I was dreaming about this series, as I was praying about it, there's one quote that haunted me and empowered me the entire time. Dallas Willard was a philosophy professor at the University of California. He was also a deep, devout follower of Jesus, and he said, it cost Jesus everything to defeat sin, but he is happy to forgive us. It takes him no time at all to say, I'll switch you places. And so when we think about this last moment with Jesus and his friends and offering the bread and the wine, it's an invitation to us to come and connect with me. And it could be a lot of people at Dwell have not been to church in a long, long time. And it feels strange to gather in a place like the Elks Lodge and to try to do something like church. And yet we're all here doing the same thing. Jesus, it's scary, but I would be willing to try to connect with you. I don't know how. I don't know if I'm ready. And yet the same was true of those 12 guys sitting around that table with Jesus. So what we'll do now is we'll have one station over here, 2 people at it, so it's kind of 2 stations. Come as you feel led, and then what they'll say to you is, this is the body and the blood of Jesus for you to connect with him. Then come back to your seat, take those elements, if you'd like to, if you feel comfortable. And for all of us, that will be a symbol of saying, yes, Jesus, I would be willing, I would try, I would do my best to connect with you. I say yes to your invitation. Let me pray for you. Jesus, would you search our hearts? Would you forgive us for the places where we've chosen misery for ourselves or misery for our brother, sister, neighbor?